This is the third part of my lecture for Ancient and Medieval Worlds on the Viking Age. Now, in the first part, we talked about some background, about the sources, about what sorts of things we need to think about in our own biases towards the Viking Age. In the second part, we talked about the beginnings of the Viking Age itself and the various regions it was a part of. We talked about the distinctions between thinking about them in terms of raiders, but also as explorers and merchants. In this final part, I want to talk about why the Viking Age came to an end. Which is in some ways almost as controversial as why it began, and is deeply complex as well. It's worth pointing out, though, the Vikings were never conquered back in their homeland, in Scandinavia and the Jutland Peninsula themselves, although they were sometimes defeated while out raiding or invading abroad. But ultimately, political, religious, and economic developments around the year 1000 effectively tamed the Norse, and they settled down and stopped acting as Vikings. They adopted the cultures of the people that they had been raiding. Not entirely, but to a large extent they assimilated into Christian European society. I want to stress that no one thing ended the Viking Age, and that this is a subject of some debate. For instance, in our next lecture, we'll be talking about agricultural developments that, combined with a brief period of warming of the climate, made overpopulation back home perhaps less of an issue. Trade routes may also have effectively provided more wealth than raiding did. Local Western European rulers started getting their acts together and defending themselves more effectively. As with any major development, the end of the Viking Age was complex, and it didn't happen overnight. Now, in class, of course, we're reading Robin Fleming's Britain After Rome. A lot of the same reasons that she describes the early medieval English kings settling down, sort of creating themselves and then settling down, could also be applied, perhaps on a larger scale, to the Scandinavian situation. Basically, these regions develop united political orders, which, as we'll see, really causes them to settle down, not just for political reasons, but also for economic reasons. It's really more sustainable to create long-distance trade networks, which the Vikings were already in the process of setting up, than it is to go out Viking and raiding continuously. We can really begin to see changes in the political situations in the Viking homelands, though. Now, some of the earliest bits of this are a little bit obscure because they tend to take place before writing really becomes established as a cultural norm in the region. And so sometimes we're relying on later sources. It's worth pointing out that early on in the Viking Age, these Norse were extremely politically fragmented. The first century of raids were conducted by petty chieftains that later sagas sometimes call sea kings. And that's to indicate that their power really lay in their fleets and not in some geographic territory back home. They might only control one or two fjords back in Norway, but they might command dozens of ships, which made them powerful raiders abroad. But we begin to see a shift sometime in the 900s, particularly in Denmark. At least starting in Denmark. Once again, we can see that exposure to more organized societies, as we've looked at before, for instance, with the Germanic confederations that slowly were changed by their contact with the Roman world, or in several other examples over the course of this class. This contact with the former Carolingian Empire, or in England, really forced the Norse, or encouraged the Norse, to politically organize themselves more effectively. Over the course of the 900s into the 1000s, now it varied from place to place. As I've mentioned, Denmark started a little earlier. Sweden was much later. The various Viking homelands, Norse homelands, were slowly unified under Norse kings and began to form the basis of the states in the region today, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Now, this didn't immediately end the Viking Age, and some of these kings were in fact able to merge the two traditions together for a while. And the 1000s were a pretty crazy time in this respect, as you get the power of a unified kingdom, but with the military ethos of the earlier Viking period together. One example of this is Canute, which I have an illustration from the time period of here. Canute Rex Canute the King. This was a Danish king who actually managed to conquer, he and his father and he managed to conquer both Norway and England, briefly holding together a so-called North Sea Empire, as modern historians call it, before it fell apart with his children. Now, later on, one of the Norwegian kings, after it split away from Canute's dynasty, actually went on crusade, the crusades that we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, and acted very much like a Viking while he was on crusade. Notice in these cases that this also involved conversion to Christianity. The kings that arose in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden recognized that the church could provide them with legitimacy and bureaucratic power that their own societies otherwise lacked, while the church recognized that working with these Viking kings was the most effective way of converting the polytheistic Norse population, because the king could apply political pressure to enforce religious change, which is exactly what they did for their own purposes. Now, it wasn't all cynical. And we do get a few martyrs. The Norse proved eventually to be very enthusiastic Christians. Ultimately, however, this made it harder for them to go raiding against their fellow Christians. Remember that norm back, even with that famous first incident, so-called, of the Viking Age with Lindisfarne, was to attack monasteries. Well, if you're a Christian, you're going to get a lot more flack for attacking a monastery from your own people. And so that's another reason that the Viking Age comes to an end, is that the Norse convert to Christianity, and that makes going a Viking a bit more difficult. They do have their own quirks for it. For instance, here is an early Viking cross, which many have compared to a Thor's hammer pendant, and we get interesting stories, particularly from the Icelanders, who, remember, voted to accept Christianity rather than having it imposed upon them, although they did so with pressure from the Norwegian kings who held economic control over Iceland at the time. But we get some interesting accounts from Icelanders preserved from this time period. For instance, I worship Christ on land, but I worship Thor on the sea. So it took a little while for them to fully accept Christianity. They don't become pacifists. It's not that they never attack a church ever again, but the church really frowned on this, and it tended to die down. And the church also frowned on enslaving fellow Christians. Christianity didn't come out with the idea that slavery was entirely wrong, but enslaving fellow Christians was seen as wrong, and that, of course, also provided a significant economic damper on the Viking Age. Ultimately, the same thing ended up happening as well to the Hungarians. They settled down into a kingdom and converted to Christianity in the year 1000 as well, which made them, again, one Christian king among many others that observed the general rules of war and diplomacy rather than a bunch of barbarian raiders. The story of the Vikings abroad is more complex, however, and locally dependent. We've already seen that the Norse in Iceland worked to preserve their culture, but this did not include raiding for a very practical reason. The Icelanders deforested their island quite rapidly and couldn't build boats. Ultimately, the Icelanders became politically and economically dependent on the Norse back home for trade and supplies, although they retained their democracy for local affairs, and still do to this day. The Norse in England settled down and created a hybrid culture with the local English, and created a great deal of modern Englishness. Not just the words that I mentioned in vocabulary, but even customs, such as the idea of trial by jury, can be traced back to these Norse-Danish settlers in England. I should note that as these examples pointed out, before the advent of Christian kings, the Norse had been a pretty democratic society in their political arrangements, and they had a complex and rich legal as well as literary culture that sadly we can't get into. Perhaps the most famous descendants of the Vikings were a group that in 911 were offered a deal by the weak later Carolingian kings of Western Francia, what is now France. This king, and we'll talk about him more later in another lecture, Charles the Simple, asked a group of Vikings, begged them might be more correct, to settle down on the coast and protect the kingdom from other Vikings, with his thought being, well, if I can't stop the Vikings, maybe I can tame some Vikings and get them to keep out the other Vikings. It's not a terrible idea. They were supposed to become his subjects in the process. This group of Vikings, led by a man named Rollo, and we'll look more again at this incident later, took up the offer, and they became known as Normans, a derivative of Northmen, and the region of France that they settled in is still known as Normandy for their northern heritage. Now, these Normans, as we shall see, rapidly adopted Christian customs. That was part of the deal with the kings of Francia, and even the French language, now fully separate from Latin, as we saw last time. But they remained feisty and independent. If there's one thing they retained from their Viking ancestors, it was a warlike attitude. They were a constant headache for the kings of France, as we shall see going forward. Now, as we shall also see, these Normans ended up conquering some of the most important kingdoms in Europe, from England to Sicily, and they were crucial players in the start of the Crusades. What we really see with the end of the Viking Age is a transformation rather than a complete ending, and one that sees them participating with other cultures. Now, I also assigned for this class a reading from Ibn Fadlan, who spent time among the Rus, or the Russia, that is, the Vikings who were settling down in Slavic lands in the east. And this is a very famous account that actually gives us our only description, contemporary description, of a Viking boat funeral, the sort of famous incident of a boat being set on fire. Now, Ibn Fadlan, remember, had his own biases. He was an Arab and a Muslim amongst what he saw as polytheistic barbarians. He was truly disgusted by some of the things that he saw them doing, but he also respected them in a variety of other ways. And that's one thing to think about as you read Ibn Fadlan's account among the Rus. Now, notably, this famous account of Ibn Fadlan became part of the basis for a movie and book written by Michael Crichton, who also wrote Jurassic Park and Sphere and other famous books turned into films, called The 13th Warrior, starring Antonio Banderas, a Spanish actor who apparently to most Americans looks Arab enough. That's the comments that one could make upon the American Hollywood movie industry there and the American viewing public are a subject for a completely different lecture. But this is a fantastic film for borrowing certain elements from Ibn Fadlan and combining them actually with none other than the story of Beowulf. And I particularly enjoy watching this film. It's not always particularly historically accurate, but actually the beginning section of it does record a number of the exact same incidents described by Ibn Fadlan. So this is something that's worth keeping in mind as you read Ibn Fadlan's account and think about what are his biases, how can we see his own Muslim prejudices in the same way that we've talked about, for instance, seeing Herodotus's Greek prejudices when talking about the Persians, or Tacitus's Roman prejudices when he talks about the Germans. So that's one to think about and keep in mind as you look at this source alongside this lecture.